Today we're going to do something completely different, and we're going to show you the road test first, and then we'll get into the details of the turbo installation. So if you're new to the channel, this lightweight all aluminum vintage Honda was fitted with a tiny 20 horsepower Kubota D722 diesel engine, and we're using a Saturn MP3 close ratio 5-speed transmission. It's an unusual combination of parts for sure, and the secret sauce that we put on it was forced induction. Now, before we installed the turbo, the little diesel engine was getting its boost from an AMR 500 supercharger. The supercharger provided instant boost, and it seemed to be the perfect match for the small displacement 20 horsepower 3-cylinder engine. So in the name of science, we ditched the supercharger and decided to have some fun with a turbo. Because why not? Anyway, this road test wasn't really supposed to happen right now because the car was literally just finished about an hour ago and nothing's been set up yet. At this point, we have no idea what the fuel rack is set up for, and there's a lot of stuff that's still a bit iffy, if you know what I mean. Meh, let's just have some fun right now, and if you want, stick around because later in the video, we'll also discuss the results of today's road test. So far, so good. Nothing's on fire and the car seems to run pretty good. Just for giggles, let's try doing a timed 0 to 55 acceleration test. The best we've ever done with the AMR 500 supercharger was 19.93 seconds. Let's see what the turbo can do. Uh-oh, we lost boost. That ain't good. Let me pull this thing over and see what's going on. Alright, this is interesting. Oh, it looks like we popped the pipe off the intake manifold and all our precious boost got vented in a hurry. Very interesting. I reckon these things happen. Now, the good news is my brother Duke had a screwdriver and we were able to fix this on the side of the road. So let's continue with our shenanigans, and this time around I'm going to keep an eye on the boost gauge. Wow, at around 3,400 RPM, the boost skyrockets way above 18 PSI. Interesting. So it looks like we're about 10 seconds slower, but to be fair, I didn't push the car as hard this time around because of the higher than expected boost pressure. Let's try this one more time, and that way I can get a feel for what's going on. This time I want to capture the 0 to 50 and the 0 to 55 times. So for 0 to 50, we need to beat 16.36 seconds, and for the 0 to 55, it's still 19.93 seconds. So on its very first outing, the turbo didn't do as well as the supercharger, and that was kind of expected. You see, we're having a massive amount of turbo lag. However, once the turbo spools up, we do get an abundant amount of glorious boost. It seems the biggest problem is the turbo just falls flat on its face as soon as we shift into 5th gear, and it takes a while for the boost to build back up again. Now, an interesting fact about this engine is it's still being controlled by the governor, which is set to 4,000 RPM, and we like to shift the transmission at around 36 to 3,800 RPM. So running the engine past 3,800 RPM doesn't provide any real benefit, and that's because the governor starts kicking in and pulling back on the fuel. In other words, the power starts going soft above 3,800 RPM. Anyway, it's not our intention to destroy this engine, and we have to work with what we have, which is basically a more or less stock 20 horsepower tiny ass but very expensive diesel engine. Now keep in mind, this is the very first time we drove the car since the turbo installation, and as a matter of fact, this is the first time the car's been driven on the streets since last summer. The good news is we only had one minor problem with the boost pipe popping off, and by some miracle nothing else broke. Not too shabby. Let's head back to the shop and we can get into the technical details of today's episode. Alright, now that we're back at our multi-billion-dollar laboratory, we can analyze the data. Well, shucks, that turns out to be a big lie, and the whole operation's actually run by 2 or 3 hillbillies out in the cornfields with a few video cameras. So you get what you pay for, but we will try our best to unpack the data. So the car was a little over 3 seconds slower on the 0 to 50 mile per hour acceleration test. However, we can certainly blame some of this on driver error, and the driver was being overly cautious due to the uncontrolled boost pressure issue. So we may be able to knock a second or two off this time with a different driving technique. Normally on these acceleration runs, I don't lift my foot from the accelerator when shifting gears, and that's perfectly safe to do because the governor will cap the engine speed. But during this test, I did lift my foot off the accelerator when pushing in the clutch and shifting the transmission. So I think we're a lot closer to the performance of the supercharger than this snapshot actually shows. Remember, today's test was the first time the car was driven since the turbo installation. Anyway, for the 0 to 55, well, we definitely have issues, and that's because in 4th gear, the fastest this car will go is about 51 or 52 miles per hour. So in order to get up to 55 miles per hour, I need to shift into 5th gear. And at that point, the party is pretty much over. We lose all the boost and the dreaded turbo lag shows its ugly face. Now, this is not a surprise at all, because in the late great turbo diesel Saturn SC1, this issue was well known, and it's the reason we ditched the turbo and went with a supercharger on the Honda build. So it's going to be interesting to see if this issue can be solved, and I do have a few ideas I want to try. So one of the biggest differences between the turbo and the supercharger is, well, with the turbo, the car rolls cold when it accelerates. Let's take another look at that. Yeah, it's a bit smoky. Now this clip was recorded last summer when the car was equipped with an AMR 500 supercharger and a bunch of electronic gizmos to manage the boost and the fuel rack. Wow, what a huge difference. So when the supercharger launches, it's at full boost and max fuel, and you can see there's very little smoke coming out of the tailpipe. On the other hand, when the turbo launches, it's at low boost and max fuel, and due to the turbo lag, the engine doesn't get up to full boost until the car gets up to speed. And as a result, we have a lot more smoke when the car launches. Now, it's also easy to lose sight of the fact that we're dealing with a tiny 20 horsepower 719cc engine. And with or without the smoke, the car actually performs extremely well, all things considered. Now, in reality, this engine is just way too small to be taken seriously, but I love the challenge despite the fact that it's pretty much pointless. Anyway, from the driver's perspective, I like the way the car feels with the turbo. You see, from the driver's seat, the engine sounds better and it seems to rev better. Plus, the car is a lot quieter. So that's a big win for the turbo. Now, to be completely fair, in this picture we're comparing a fully sorted out supercharged engine to an engine with a turbo that has zero tuning. I think we definitely have room for improvement, or at least I'll have fun trying, because after all, this is just a fun project, and we'll see what can be done on an extreme budget with backyard engineering. Oh, and one more thing. Today we ran the car with the hood off, and that's so we can keep an eye on the engine. Now I'm going to go ahead and play a clip that we recorded, and you can see some smoke coming from the engine bay. Meh, who cares, right? After all, it is a diesel, but have a watch. Yep, we do have a bit of smoke, and I isolated 2 frames of the video so you can see where the smoke is coming from. It turns out we have an exhaust leak between the manifold and the turbo. So what that means is we're venting precious exhaust gas pressure before it gets a chance to spool up the turbo, and that's not good. Let's have a look at the actual problem. Well, someone forgot to tighten one of the turbo bolts, so I blame the idiot who put the turbo on. Now it also looks like we have a pinhole in the weld, and that would be the fault of the person who welded up this thingy. I wonder who that could be. Anyway, we would have caught this problem with or without the camera pointed at the engine. It's kinda obvious. So the good news is it's a simple fix and it will directly affect the performance. I'm not sure how much of an improvement we'll get by correcting this, but it'll be an improvement nonetheless. Now, if you made it this far into the video, that's awesome. Click on the like button because, well, I engineered this video to provide the more entertaining parts first, and now we can move on to the nuts and bolts part, and you can see the events that led up to today's episode. So the turbo project was temporarily on hold for about a week, and we had the RHB31 turbo about halfway installed. Now, the problem we encountered was we found another turbo that was allegedly made for a Kubota diesel engine, and we wanted to have a better look at it before we finished installing our current turbo. So this is the turbo that we picked up. Now, at first glance, this guy seems to be more user-friendly, and that's as far as the input and output on the compressor side of the turbo. But on the turbine side, things are not looking so good. You see, I was led to believe that this flange would bolt right up to a Kubota manifold, and that's absolutely not true. This flange is quite a bit different, and it's not a bolt-on turbo. As a matter of fact, when we compare the flange on this turbo to the stock Kubota manifold gasket, there's a big enough difference to make this turbo not a good solution after all. So getting the flange to mate with the Kubota manifold is a big problem, but it can be solved. The real issue is this new turbo is way bigger than the RHB31 turbo that we planned on using. Now, as it turns out, we really don't have enough space for the RHB31 turbo to begin with, and it's going to be a tight fit in the engine bay of the little Honda. Anyway, once you factor in everything that it will take to get the new turbo to fit, it's just not going to happen. So we'll continue with the original plan and use the RHB31 turbo. This happens sometimes when you try to put 10 pounds of poop in a 5-pound bag. This time, there just isn't enough space to do that. So in this snapshot, it may appear that we have an unlimited amount of room, and I wish that was the case. However, to get extra room to work on the turbo and the exhaust, I went ahead and pulled the radiator and the radiator support. But just for reference, right here on this corner of the turbo flange, well, we have a fitment issue, and the turbo is going to come in direct contact with the radiator support. So we're going to have to do some cutting on the radiator support. Plus, keep in mind, we're also going to need to run the intake plumbing, the boost pipes, and finish routing the exhaust. So this wide open area will fill up fast once we start making all the connections. Now, in the event we do decide to use a different turbo in the future, this time around we're fabricating the downpipe in sections and we'll be using V-clamps to hold everything together. This will make any possible future modifications so much easier. Alright, let's finish making that downpipe. So we have the majority of the downpipe kind of roughed in, and we need to do some trimming and a few tack welds to get stuff to fit perfectly. And like I mentioned earlier, we're going to be using V-clamps on this section of the exhaust so it can be easily modified at a later date. Alright, we have a workable solution. So, the way the exhaust fits under the engine, we don't have a lot of wiggle room, and the shape of the exhaust pretty much is how we had to do it in order to have enough clearance for the belly pan that fits under the engine bay. Now, I would love to put another V-clamp right here, but there just isn't enough space for it once the front of the car is put back together. Fast forward a little bit, and this is the finished turbo downpipe. We ended up having to section in this extension to get a perfect stress-free fit once everything was clamped together. Another way of saying it is, this is a bit of an oopsie, but in the end, it worked out fine. So the wastegate on this turbo is going to be locked shut, and that's because when the turbo was used on the late great Saturn with the same Kubota diesel engine, well, we never got more than 16 psi of boost from it. It turns out the turbo can make way more than 16 pounds of boost, go figure. Anyway, to lock the wastegate in place, we drilled and threaded a hole in the turbo exit flange, and we're going to use this bolt to apply pressure to the wastegate. This bolt, along with a lock nut, will keep the wastegate tightly closed, just like we want. But if it comes down to it, we can put this turbo back to its original specs and have the wastegate open at 15 psi of boost. So 15 psi of boost is a reasonable number considering this engine is completely stock and it was never meant to handle boost. Actually, the engine starts making noises at around 12 psi, and I'm not sure if it's the valves ticking or the injectors. The bottom line is, this engine would likely need some expensive modifications if we wanted it to survive at higher boost levels, and that's just not in the budget right now. I prefer to be more on the safe side than to damage this very expensive engine that we're using. So at this point, we can fit the turbo onto the engine now that we finished building the downpipe. So the bolts that hold the turbo in place require a special cut-down Allen wrench, and that's because there's very little room to swing a wrench on this fabricated part. Now, of course, all of this was filmed days before the road test, and if I could, I would tell Jimbo to tighten down all the bolts, but it's already too late, and we've seen the results of his mistakes. But it's interesting to see the mistakes as they happen. Anyway, with the turbo in place, it was time to tap into the oil supply and route some much needed oil to the turbo. And as you can see, we kept the oil pressure sending unit in place. So with the oil going to the turbo, we also needed a path for the oil to return to the engine sump. Now, since this engine was equipped with a turbo in the past, the sump was already modified for a return line. Now, due to space issues, the output side of the turbo has to face down, otherwise the boost pipe would come in contact with the hood on the car and you wouldn't be able to close the hood. So the turbo installation is not just a bunch of random decisions. Nope, everything has to be fitted multiple times and solutions need to be found. Now, the ultimate goal is to get all this junk to fit in the engine bay and still be able to close the hood on a car. It's very important that the car looks as normal as it can because this is the way we do things around here. So my background is in electronics and writing code, and I'm certainly not an expert in fabrication, so I have to use the skills that I do have. Now, fortunately, I can get the job done and do it on a tight budget, but I'm sure there are folks out there with better skills and more cash and can do a better job. Meh, at least I have the confidence in building stuff and making videos of my work. And I don't mind showing a large audience my adventures in automotive nonsense. Fast forward many hours, and the car is more or less put back together. We still have to zip tie some wires and things out of the way, but the good news is everything sort of fit, with the exception of the upper radiator hose. I have the parts ordered to get this hose to fit a little better, but for now it'll work just fine. Now over here we have a bit of a mess, but it all fits and that's good enough for me. Now I'm sure we're going to make plenty of changes and things are going to get moved around as they always do. So this is interesting, and yeah, I know there's wires and stuff hanging loosely. Anyway, here's a comparison of the downpipe we used on the turbo diesel Saturn versus the downpipe we're using on the Honda. Now, one of the things we learned on the turbo diesel Saturn experiment was, well, the little Kubota engine loves a big downpipe. Now, consider this. The engine is a 3-cylinder with a displacement of 719 cc's, and each cylinder is only 233 cc's. Now, with that in mind, this downpipe is huge. But apparently this is what the little engine wants. But that's based on the fact that the engine loved the big downpipe for fuel economy, and I'm not really sure this is the right thing to do for performance. Anyway, let's fire this thing up and see how it runs. Yep, there's nothing coming from the turbo at idle. You know, my old Mercedes could be used as a hairdryer at idle, but that was a much larger engine. So let's try an experiment and I'll show you how pathetic this turbo is at idle. This is pretty much normal, and it would be nice to have slightly more wind coming out of the turbo, but it is what it is. So fast forward and the car is ready for the road test. No, not that car. Nobody wants to drive that thing. This car. Yep, all the wires have been zip tied out of the way and the exhaust gas temperature gauge has been connected, and we definitely need to keep an eye on that exhaust gas temperature gauge. Now here's something interesting that I spotted while editing the video. Let's pause for a moment. Now right here we can see the hose clamp that connects the boost pipe to the intake manifold has been installed incorrectly. Well, I guess future Jimbo's going to find this out as soon as he stomps on the accelerator. Anyway, if you want to see the full road test, well, just restart the video and boom, the road test begins. I had a lot of fun today, and it's good to be back in the silly, underpowered Honda. Now, will this car ever be fast? Nah, I doubt it, but we're going to have fun trying. Anyway, I recommend you subscribe if you want to be kept up to date on our future shenanigans. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and I'll see you next time. Until then.
You don't have any screwdriver, do you?
Oh, you do?
Yeah, let me check.
Regular? Yeah.